So I want to begin this session, which is the third in this series of 4 about the Transcendentalists, by saying just a word about the title of my book, because I don't want that subtitle to imply that I believe that the Transcendentalists started the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice. I mean, that would be, you'd have to go back a lot further. But authors, don't have full control over the title of their books. Publishers do. My working title for this book was Transcendentalist Disciples and the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice. Beacon Press loved the manuscript, my editor's summary of it, but the marketing people said, Transcendentalist, to too many book buyers, conjures up nothing but transcendental meditation. And that they'd prefer that the word appear only in the subtitle. So I immediately thought of Brenda Wineapple's brilliant book about the friendship between Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Emily Dickinson, which I make use of in the book. It's called White Heat, a line from one of Emily's poems. And then I proposed as the title for my whole book, the original title of just the prologue, Conflagration, in which an abolitionist minister dies at sea amid burning bales of cotton, the death of Charles Follen. So I think I make it clear in the text itself, as I said last week, that while I believe that the myth of Seneca Falls unjustly neglects Margaret Fuller and the Boston Transcendentalists in telling the herstory of gender justice in America, when it comes to anti-racism and abolition, there were many earlier efforts, both by Black activists and white allies, to end slavery in America. Take the tale that I tell about Charles Follen, coming home from a preaching engagement 9 years before his death in a rainstorm, taking into his carriage this elderly Black man who talks with him about Daniel Walker, whose 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world called for them to rise up and claim basic human rights. Follen knew that that argument was very similar to the one that he himself had made in justifying rebellion against tyranny when he had been a young idealist back in Germany and a young law professor, from which, of course, he'd been driven into exile, only to become a fairly respectable member of the Boston gentry. He was teaching at Harvard. He was married to a Cabot, Eliza Lee Cabot. He was studying for the Unitarian ministry under her pastor, William Ellery Channing. But we can also not forget the economic and cultural and political timing of all of this. Because when it comes to thinking about who was an abolitionist, the question is when? And with what program? That is, what means were you proposing to use to end slavery in America? Now, a lot of historians of abolitionism have used Garrison as sort of the touchstone of who's a white abolitionist. And certainly the launching of The Liberator, his publication in January of 1831, with the manifesto of which I reproduce in the book, was a major event in gathering white allies around Black abolitionism. It was a direct response to Walker. And Garrison saying, by golly, we've got to end this slavery right now, immediately. But we have to do it by moral persuasion. Why did he say that? Partly because Walker's appeal to colored citizens around the world was considered so incendiary that if you were caught with a copy in South Carolina, you would be subject to death. It seemed to be a call for black enslaved persons to rise up and kill their white oppressors. This was, of course, a major fear around the Atlantic cultural zone of the early 19th century, where in fact some of that had happened in Haiti during the French Revolution, when blacks in Haiti rose up, and there was indeed something of a recrimination against the slave owners of Haiti. And it had happened in a much milder degree in Jamaica, when the British decided that it was no longer in their economic best interest to try to maintain slavery. So one of the other things that happens during this period is that the British are already considering abolitionism before America does. In 1833, Lydia Maria Child writes an appeal that the title of which is clearly based on Walker's, called An Appeal on Behalf of That Class of Americans Called Africans. I mean, there's a whole remarkable statement built into the very title of that book. And she sends a copy to William Ellery Channing. It's not clear to me whether Fallon read Channing's copy or had one of his own, but both of them were profoundly moved by Lydia Maria Child's book on this subject in 1833. It's the same year that the British Parliament passes their act ending slavery in the Caribbean colonies, especially Jamaica and the others. Channing walks to Lydia Maria Child's house at the very opposite end of Boston, despite the fact that he's really not doing well with his tuberculosis, and spends a whole day talking with her about this appeal. He doesn't do anything about it immediately, and shortly thereafter he gets a visit from Samuel Joseph May, another Unitarian minister who had signed on with Garrison and the Anti-Slavery Society, formed in 1832, as a spokesperson or agent. And Channing is reproved by May. You're the most influential minister in Boston. Why don't you speak out about slavery? And Channing says, I acknowledge the justice of your reproof, Brother Joseph. And that year, because of his health, the prescription for TB, by the way, was go to a warmer climate. So he took himself and his family down to the British West Indies, the Virgin Islands. And he saw how the liberation of slaves in that part of the world was going. Now, the British had done two things that Garrison didn't approve of. First of all, they hadn't made emancipation immediate. They said, we need a transition time in which people who own plantations and who claim to own human property are still going to be required to provide basic housing, food, protection. And over a 6-year period in which the formerly enslaved are apprenticed to the free market labor economy, they can work out, but it's going to be subsidized. So there was the second thing that Garrison objected to was that the British actually paid significant money to the landowners, the slave owners in the British West Indies to get rid of the system. Now, I think one of the reasons that they did that was that slavery in certain economies wasn't working. It wasn't working in the British West Indies, where the primary crop had been slavery. There were, by that point, too many enslaved people for the value of the crop. And the same thing had happened around Chesapeake Bay and in Virginia, where the primary crop was tobacco. There are some people who felt at that time, I think justifiably, that slavery was going to collapse because it was economically inefficient. Nobody has any motivation to really work very hard if all they're going to get is slavery, the potential separation of their family, and nothing but you know, a cabin and a little gruel, and maybe the right to farm a little patch next to the cabin. Now, all of this is prior to the formation of the Transcendentalist Circle in 1836. I will say that most of the people who came together in that circle, starting with Emerson and Frederick Henry Hedge and the like, they had all also been observing another form of racism going on in America, which is particularly relevant to those of you who live in the southeastern part of the United States. I hope you know about the Cherokee removal and Andrew Jackson. So here's a piece of economic understanding that I didn't have until I started really digging into this book. In 1837, a year after the Transcendentalist Circle begins, there's a major economic collapse in America. And what's it caused by? Well, we may be in the middle of the first economic collapse in America that has not been tied up with excess speculation in something. This one's all about disease. But the last economic collapse, a decade ago, was about economic speculation in what? Mortgage-backed securities. Guess what the economic speculation was about in 1837? Bets on the growing value of cotton lands and field hands. There had been after Andrew Jackson removed the Cherokee and most of the other tribes of the Southeast, the Western Georgia, Alabama, parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Northern Louisiana, all open up as places to raise slave-picked cotton. The land speculation was rampant. The speculation in the value of the enslaved workers was rampant. Jackson also ended the early version of a Federal Reserve, the Bank of the United States, and said, let there be nothing but little local banks. I don't know how many of you in Knoxville remember Mr. Butcher and his bank. It was just a great example of what unregulated banking can do. And in 1836 and 7, by the way, there were little banks all over the Delta of Mississippi. They were issuing their own currency. There were no, if you look at your dollar bill, it comes from the Federal Reserve. Every little bank could issue its own paper money, backed by nothing but the loans that they had put out to buy more field hands or more cotton lands. And at a certain point, there's too much cotton coming to Britain and to the Northeast. By the way, the Northeast of the United States was secondary to the primary cotton market, which were the textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool and the Northwest of England. So there's a collapse in the price of cotton, a collapse in the price of cotton lands, a collapse in the price of field hands. It just blew my mind to realize that the economic situation in which transcendentalism emerges is a collapse of excess speculation on enslaved labor and cotton. It helps to explain why they were so convinced that unregulated materialism was something that needed to be subjected to some moral scrutiny and some moral ideals. Now, the political context also needs to be discussed just a little bit. You know, we have a populist president today. He's not the first Dumbo who's been ever elected to the White House. In 1840, we had an election that produced a campaign in which the business-interested party, the Whigs, put forward as their candidate a anti-Indian general, William Henry Harrison, and as his vice president, the early equivalent of Sarah Palin, somebody even dumber. Harrison lasted about 31 days as U.S. president because he caught pneumonia at his own inauguration, and John Tyler of Virginia, a slave owner, previously a Democrat, not a Whig, became the president of the United States. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. One of the dumbest elections in American history until the last one. The big issue in the 1840s, which is the era in which I'm talking about the Transcendentalists in relation to anti-slavery and abolition, has to do with Texas. And I'm sorry our friend Ron Blake, who lives in Texas, is not with us this evening, but I'm going to send him a copy of this talk. Texas had broken free from Mexico in 1824. Mostly by people who had come from Tennessee. I remember when I lived in Knoxville, I learned that there were folks in the census rolls in Tennessee where the clerk would just put GTT, gone to Texas. Which is a little bit like what some minister colleagues and I have done sometimes on membership rolls, where we put BPO. That is somebody who thinks that they're a member of the congregation, but BPO means burial purposes only. All the way through the 1840s, Southerners who had already expanded across all of these lands that they had stolen from Native Americans were now wanting to expand even further into Texas. Their political calculation was that unless slavery continued to expand and to have at least half of the membership of the United States Senate, slavery was going to become surrounded by anti-slavery and squeezed out of existence. It was not an unreasonable political calculation. But this struggle between slavery expansionism and anti-slavery influences the whole politics of the 1840s and 50s. In 1844, James K. Polk, former Speaker of the House of Representatives and good Tennessean, a disciple of Andrew Jackson, gets elected to the U.S. presidency, and he makes it clear Texas is coming in, even if I have to jig up a war to make it happen. And just as happened in the Gulf of Tonkin or any other, made up story about why we need to go to war, he sent American troops into the disputed land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande in South Texas. And when the Mexicans objected, he said, well, they fired on us first. The Mexican War begins. All across the northern part of America, there is an objection to that as nothing but a slave power grab that is headed for American disaster. You begin to get here, then, the realization that maybe Garrison's approach to abolitionism ain't going to work, because it's all tied up with two things. We're going to do it by moral persuasion, and we are not going to be dickering with dirty politics. Garrison's people literally refused to vote in most of these elections. Does this sound relevant today? We have people who are so pure in their ideals that they think, oh, I'm not going to get engaged in the question of driving the idiot out of the White House. So by 1848, when Zachary Taylor, a victorious general in the Mexican War, is elected, and again dies, putting a wishy-washy vice president in place, Millard Fillmore, by the way, was a Unitarian lawyer from Buffalo. He has many things to answer for in that next life that most of us don't really quite believe in. Like signing the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, or for that matter, sending Commodore Perry to invade Japan. Once you get to 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law, the whole context of American abolitionism changes. Before 1850, it actually meant something to stick your neck out, to say that slavery needs to end. By 1850, even the businessmen knew that it was better to do that. That's when the fugitive slaves who come to Boston create these rescue episodes that I detail in the book, because the Transcendentalists were so involved physically in every one of them. They have given up on the idea that you're going to just be able to end slavery by moral persuasion. They think it's going to have to be with the use of some force. Chris is there waiting. Let me put him in. By the early 1850s, one fugitive slave after another, and by the way, Fillmore had the good sense not to try to enforce the fugitive slave law in a place like Massachusetts unless he was really pressured to do so. But I should go back up and say that all the way through this period, you would not believe how much anti-abolitionist violence there was. There were riots in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, not chasing fugitive slaves, but chasing the people who were trying to protect them. They captured Garrison in 1835 in Boston, and almost strung him up on the Boston Common. There was a debate among the people who captured him, who were mostly working class whites, put up to it by wealthy people who had interests in the cotton mills. They were debating about whether they should hang him or just tar and feather him. It was even worse in places like Philadelphia and New York, the anti-abolitionist violence in the 1830s and 40s. So you really had to stick your neck out in the early years to be an abolitionist. But by the 1850s, with people like Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who owned the textile mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, when the fugitive slave Anthony Buehrens is sent back to slavery, despite the massive intervention orchestrated by people like Theodore Parker and personed by Lewis Hayden and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who actually pounded down the courthouse door to try to rescue Anthony Buehrens. Lawrence writes in his journal, we went to bed last night as conservative cotton wigs and woke up this morning stark raving abolitionists. So when you evaluate the term abolitionism in American history, and I think I try to make this clear in the book, although I'll tell you, it's fun to be able to talk about the book more thematically this way, because I have to mix together chronologically the women's rights work, the other social change work, with the anti-slavery work as I go along in the narrative of the book. But it's very important for you as you look at the book to realize that by 1854, almost everybody in the North who wasn't frightened of Black liberation was an abolitionist. But don't kid yourself. Resistance to Black freedom continued all throughout the North, even well into the Civil War. In the middle of the Civil War, there were anti-draft riots trying to make peace with the South. Let them have their slaves. Let them go away. In the most dramatic scenes, I think, in the book, you really do have these incredible friendships crossing racial lines. 1846, a fugitive slave from Kentucky named Lewis Hayden arrives in Boston. He's trying out to be a speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison's outfit. Where's his tryout? It's on the slopes above Walden Pond in Concord, under the sponsorship of the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Concord, led by Thoreau's mother and sisters. It's Emancipation Day, the 10th anniversary of when the emancipation of slaves in the British West Indies actually took effect in 1836. That was a holy day for freed African Americans all through this period, the 1st of August. And Emerson gets up to speak, and Wendell Phillips gets up to speak, and Lewis Hayden tries to do what I would call sort of a Frederick Douglass, let me tell you what I went through, imitation. But he didn't have Frederick Douglass's education or eloquence. And so it didn't go well, and Phillips ends up firing him as a speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society. Like Garrison, Phillips was not a Unitarian, not a Transcendentalist, he was a Calvinist. You either got it or you don't. It's predestined. The Unitarians, like a young lawyer named John Albion Andrews, don't give up on Lewis Hayden. They helped set him up in the same kind of business that Daniel Walker had, providing used clothing and to people who were coming north, facing a New England winter or going on to Canada. They set up his wife to run a boarding house that became the Boston center of the fugitive slave Underground Railroad. When Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, came to Boston to talk with her fellow anti-slavery people there, she visited Hayden's house and discovered that there were 13 people fleeing slavery who were there that night alone. The way in which this circle of white and black allies developed in Boston is a very complicated story that some of my better colleagues are still working on, because they couldn't write much down. It all had to be done in conversation and interpersonal relationship. But it was a true partnership in many ways. Lewis Hayden becomes Boston's leading black abolitionist because of John Albion Andrews' intervention to help set him up in this business in the boarding house. He becomes the first person to suggest to John Andrew that he's got a political future, for the paradoxical reason that he has really stuck his neck out as the lawyer for the Secret Six, who in 1859 provided the funds and the guns for the most radical white abolitionist, John Brown, to attempt to start a slave insurrection by seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Those six people, by the way, 5 of them were clearly Transcendentalists, and Jarrett Smith, who comes from a Presbyterian background in upstate New York, was one of those people who had kind of given up on orthodoxy and become a Transcendentalist without quite having any direct connection to the Transcendentalist circle itself. But it's Parker. It's Franklin Sanborn, the young schoolmaster in Concord, Massachusetts, who was a disciple of Emerson's. It's Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whose story is, God, somebody needs to write a better biography of that man. In any case, by 1859, abolitionism is clearly the stance that the whole South sees behind even a relative moderate like Abraham Lincoln. And if you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about how Lincoln put together a cabinet that was a team of rivals, he had people who were all along the spectrum of anti-slavery. That is, they had different ideas about how to end it. But they were all, by that time, determined to either limit its expansion and squeeze it to death, or do something more drastic. So with that, I think I'm going to unmute all of you and engage us in some conversation about what we understand about Transcendentalism and its involvement with the American abolitionist movement, and what we still are puzzled about. So I'm unmuting you all, and if you can find a way to signal that you are, oh, come on, unmute all. All right, I may have to do it one by one.
Everybody can do it for themselves.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself, so.
Okay, please do it. If you can unmute yourselves, it will help me because my unmute all is not working.
Well, John, I want to second your thing about Thomas Wentworth Higginson needing a better biography. I found an anthology of his writings in, of all places, the Pigeon Forge book outlet. And I mean, the very unlikely, but it's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing anthology on comparative religion and equal rights and abolition, and his records as a commander of African American troops in the Civil War. It is just astonishing, breathtaking, firsthand account of his life, and a good biography is well overdue.
Thank you, Chris, because that gives me an opportunity to say, you know, we always think of the black soldiers in the Civil War as starting with the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers and their young Transcendentalist Unitarian colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, who were immortalized by that wonderful film of almost 30 years ago now, I think, Glory, with Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington and so forth. Well, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was a white officer of black troops before that.
Yeah.
With the 1st South Carolina Volunteers down in the Sea Islands of Georgia. And one of the things that moves me about his record as a white ally, you know, that the War Department just would not let blacks be their own officers. So they had to have white officers.
Yeah.
But Higginson actually listened to his men. He would sit down in the evening when they were singing around the campfire and take down the words of the spirituals. And his little book, Army Life in a Black Regiment, has a whole chapter in which he transcribes the lyrics of the African American spirituals and credits them with sustaining the souls of these African American men who were fighting for the freedom of their own bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, the interesting difference between Higginson and Gould is Higginson is leading Southern. These are Southern African Americans, so they're people fighting for their own freedom against slavery in their home territory. So,
yeah, a rather complicated story about how the Union dealt with these Sea Island plantations, which they captured relatively early in the war using naval forces. And then they, you know, because all of the white owners fled. So suddenly you've got a bunch of white Northerners who are in charge of literally thousands of illiterate plantation workers.
Yeah.
And what are they going to do? So there's a wonderful book by Willie Lee Rose, an African-American female historian who died just not too terribly long ago, called The Port Royal Experiment, which is about how a lot of folks, including a bunch of Unitarians and a few Universalists, went to the Sea Islands of Georgia and started to set up schools. And there's an argument about whether the men were in any way coerced into joining a regiment like the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Well, there wasn't much else to do. And the real challenge for African Americans during this period was to persuade Northern whites that African Americans formerly enslaved were not just passive, that they were willing to fight for their own freedom. This, of course, becomes a major issue surrounding Lincoln's Emancipation Declaration of January the 1st, 1863, the preliminary proclamation coming out 6 months before that. The politics of emancipation are all tied up with these issues from way back when. So Higginson is a key character in that. He was clearly chomping at the bit to go from being a real radical activist for Black freedom in Boston, I mean, with Lewis Hayden, taking a battering ram in 1854 and pounding down the courthouse door, trying to rescue Anthony Buehrens.
Now, John, one of the things about your book that you didn't talk about that I found interesting was how the developing commitment to abolitionism split the Unitarian clergy in the area. Channing's wanting to do a memorial service for
for Fallen.
Fallen.
But that's way back in 1840.
Caused him essentially to be forced out of his pastorate at Federal Street, and you have Parker on one hand being the flamethrower, and others on the other end being kind of the. So there seemed to be a large theological conflict, discussion. What's the right word? From the Boston area Unitarian ministers about abolitionism in the period up until.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jeff. But you have to the conversation among the Unitarians of Boston. It depends on what year you're talking about. So by 1848, 49, James Freeman Clark, who's the thread figure in my book, is able to get 173 Unitarian ministers to sign a petition to Congress to end slavery.
But before it was a big flip.
That's over half of the Unitarian ministers who existed back then. There always was going to be a spectrum, because one of the issues was, is it proper for religious people to engage in political issues? Right? Still an issue raised on many fronts today. Or should we just stick to religion as though it could be separated from its ethical and political implications? But you had more pietistic people who were saying, no, this is about saving individual souls, not about dividing the congregation over political issues. And so you can watch that happening all the way through this period. And again, have we ever escaped that question? No. And we probably never will, because trying to keep together the spiritual community with a diversity of opinions is as difficult now as it was back in the 1830s and 40s. Clark is the guy who says that the original Transcendentalist circle called themselves the like-minded because no two of them thought alike. And Bill, you're raising your hand, I think.
Yeah, just it relates to what Jeff just asked, because I was impressed in the book. I always think what I knew, my more limited knowledge of history than probably most, but so many of the abolitionists were still very racist. And they were kind of the racist abolitionists versus the ones I was so impressed with, people like ministers like Parker or Clark, who were associating and in each other's homes and kind of struggling together. I'm sure there were lots of social differences, but there was a real friendship there. Is more of a comment. That was just impressive. I know it wasn't everyone, or maybe even most. But I wonder, here's the question, is that partly rooted in what you outlined in the beginning of your series in your book about the stress on kind of that value of all human beings, that, you know, further anti-Calvinist orthodoxy, that and if everybody has value, then African Americans must have value too, and women must have value too. I mean, so it leads to that. Is there a through line of all of that, would you say?
So I think there are two philosophical strands that are in tension during that period and probably are still with us. One is grounded in this sort of universalism, ethical universalism that is philosophical. It's grounded in Kant. I have to treat you as a moral agent. My destiny is tied up with you fully exercising your moral and spiritual capacity. The other side of it, believe it or not, has to do with what I would call a sloppy understanding of evolution. Because in the 19th century, with its notion of historical progress, some people were considered to be more evolved than others. And you really get into this when you take a look at how other religious traditions were treated. There is a tendency here, and Clark is culpable of this, I think, to some degree. There's a tendency to think, well, Christianity is the most evolved religion. First, you get, sort of tribal religions, and then you get polytheistic religions, and then you get the monotheistic religions, of which ours is the most self-sacrificing and altruistic. By the period after the Civil War, Clark is clearly taking his lectures at Harvard on ethnic religions and his essays in the Atlantic on the 10 great religions of the world, and using that as a framework for understanding comparative religion, and it won't completely wash, not by contemporary standards. But the same thing was true about race. There is a tremendous amount of 19th century ethnocentric thinking. Even progressive thinkers like the German philosopher Herder thought that each linguistic and ethnic group had its own particular genius. And this lies behind 19th century nationalism. Why does the mix of people in a place like Transylvania need to be sorted out so that it's Germans over here and Hungarians over there and Romanians over there? This goes on all the way through World War I, where Woodrow Wilson is championing self-determination, which amounts to the separation of different ethnic groups who often have ideas about, well, we're more evolved than those people.
Yeah.
What's that song that Lehrer did back in the 1970s about the Greeks hate the Turks and the Turks hate the Jews, and and I don't like anybody very much.
Tom Lear.
Those evolutionary ideas of ethnic and racial superiority were absolutely endemic all the way through the 19th century, and they're not gone.
They go well into the 20th century.
Yeah, no kidding.
John Wilson. Of course, Wilson's
into the 21st.
Yeah,
but Wilson, Wilson's a Virginian.
yes, and a Presbyterian.
And he, for example, when Paul Robeson's father tried to get his son into Princeton, Woodrow Wilson wouldn't hear of it.
Right.
Because Paul was
Right.
Yeah,
he raised
did pretty well.
Where his father was the head of the outfit, and he had a lot of ingrained racialism. He also was resistant to women's suffrage. And again, this goes back to some tensions theological. There are some things that God has predestined.
And there was even a statistical, Arthur Galton and statistical movement proving this.
And you get American Unitarians like the president of Stanford, David Starr Jordan, who in the early 20th century is he's supporting eugenics on the basis of some groups being clearly far more advanced and evolved than others. This was culturally quite pervasive, and we're not free of it yet.
Yeah, Stephen Jay book called Measure of Man is good on this.
I always like to hear from my fellow historians.
I was going to observe that embarrassingly, Thomas Starr Jordan and John Buehrens share a publisher, Beacon Press.
Yeah. Our own publication history has not been free of horrible mistakes in the judgment. David Starr Jordan's eugenics works were published by Beacon Press. The other book that always comes to my mind when I think about Beacon's mistakes in publishing in the past is the Blanchard book.
Yeah.
Well, Blanchard's book in the late 1940s, which was just a horrendous screed against Roman Catholicism.
Yep.
As trying to take over the world. Oh, please.
Austin.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we are often more shaped by what we fear than we want to believe. So one of the things I've been trying to say about the abolitionists, of course, is that the shape of what was feared in this period and what people could have faith in kept shifting. They were initially very afraid that anything like immediate abolitionism would result in hate and a slaughter of slave owners. Then you get the working classes, the white working classes, who are afraid that, and I think this had some justification in it, by the way, if we let the enslaved blacks enter the labor market, our wages will go down. My best interest is not tied up with, and of course we're seeing things like that today in white working class attitudes towards immigration. So fear is often tied up with these attitudes in ways that we can't ignore. And you've got a constant struggle. This is why this book is partly religious or spiritual history. It's a constant struggle between fear and faith. And, Parker's great statements. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Is faith in government of the people, by the people, for the people. Whoa, these things are being tested today in our hearts. I can't tell you how many times in the last few months I've heard Unitarian Universalists say, I don't believe that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. Now, I don't think Parker ever suggested that it would bend without a little moral weight being exercised by those who had some power to do the bending. But if we give up on that confidence that we can bend the arc of history, woo, and worse, the fact that we have a moron in the White House is, of course, a testimony against democracy. Why should we let every idiot vote? But if we give up on government of the people, by the people, being persuaded to go back to work for the people, we're in deep doo-doo. So the relevance of some of these issues is just palpable to me, and I hope to you. One of the things that holds us back from keeping faith with these things, which are tied in with the longer arc of a progressive view of American history, is that we don't have the historical information. We are almost self-consciously amnesiac. That's old stuff. I'm just informed by my ideas of the future or my analysis of the present. But you cannot do political activism that has any prudence or strategy behind it without being historically informed. And here I'm reminded of one of the things that persuaded me to run for the presidency of the denomination back in the early 1990s. In 1991, I think it was, no, 1990, I had the opportunity to take a group to Israel and the occupied territories and then take a month off. My colleague, Forrest Church, had gone off on a mini sabbatical and left me with a large amount of work and no vacation. And I took a month off and I traveled in Greece and the islands, meditating on religion and democracy. And I'm in a bookstore in Athens in 1990, and I stumbled across a little book called, I'm a block on it. And it's by a female political scientist from Yale. But it's basically a history of Athenian democracy, which was very imperfect. They still had slaves. But she said, it's important not to judge Athenian democracy, which only lasted for about 70 years. By the philosophers who commented after it had failed. Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, who was the tutor to Alexander the Great. Plato, who in the Republic decided that, well, you shouldn't trust people to run their own affairs. You should have a dictatorship, a republic of the enlightened. The educated, the smart. That leads ultimately to people like Lenin and his notion of the advance guard of the proletariat only being the people who have fully understood where history should be going. That kind of dictatorship. No, she said, you've got to understand that there were three elements that actually made democracy work for a while. And I think this is still relevant. I think it was true in the 19th century, and I think it's true today. You better know history. Democracies left to their own devices tend to become overambitious and to think that they're real special. In the time of the Greeks, Athens thought it was so special that, well, let's go invade Sicily.
Real special.
That was their version of Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. It was an overextension of their power. And it led to the collapse of the Athenian democracy. Who spoke against it? Thucydides, the historian, has Pericles, the great democratic leader, pleading with the people. Shades of Gene McCarthy and many others, don't do it. And yet they go ahead and do it because they think they can get away with it. The second element that maintains a democracy, she said, is, Thucydides was talking about Pericles as an orator, as a rhetorician. Now, Plato hated rhetoricians. He hated poets because they can just distort things. They'll use metaphors, and that's what we preachers do. It's not completely rational. No, neither are human beings, if you ask me. But he said rhetoric is essential to a democracy. Here's the point. It shouldn't be rhetoric the way Plato thought it was, which is just lawyers for hire. Advocates for whatever is convenient for economic self-interest. It should be people who care about the quality of discourse in the forum itself. Okay. So I'm going to block on the name of the rhetorician that this book lifted up as the exemplar of somebody who said it's not just about how easily you persuade other people, it's about how you care about the quality of discourse.
Your what?
And then lastly, her name is coming to me, it's Cynthia something or other. She argued that all democracies have to have some sense of what is the relationship between the one, the individual, and the many. And that has to be at a profound philosophical level, almost metaphysical. In Athens, the philosopher was named Democritus. He's the guy who originates atomistic theory, that all of reality is made up of these little things, just as society is made up of individuals, and that they have to be understood as being in a right relationship with one another. So I read this book when I was traveling in Greece, and I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, Buehrens, you do care about history. You actually care about the quality of discourse that goes on in communities. And you're not too tied to atomistic individualism, but you have a process theology, an understanding of history unfolding in right process between its various elements that might be useful as you try to go into leadership in a rather chaotic, almost anarchistic religious movement that thinks it's democratic, but often doesn't use history well, doesn't protect the forum all that well, and certainly does not have a process view of its own purposefulness. That's why I ran for president. That's why I keep writing these books. That's why I keep teaching.
John, there's another aspect to Greek democracy.
Yes.
It comes from the philosopher Paul Woodruff at the University of Texas, who wrote this wonderful book called Reverence.
Oh, yes.
He also, which is one of my favorite books. He also wrote a book called The Necessity of Theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is interesting in its own way. But one of the things he points to is that in Athens, in the theater, ordinary people played in the choruses of the Greek plays.
Yes.
And in that way, they developed community around the arts. And they would talk about, well, we danced together in the theater and we're all together. And that's an interesting idea and Paul talks a lot about how important theater is to our human existence. But the idea that they were involved together in this arts production brought them together and helped them with democracy. It's a weird little thought, but it's...
No, I think it's very relevant, and it brings me back to reminding people that one of the things that our Transcendentalist forebears had that we don't have, they all read Latin and Greek.
Yes.
They had a classical education.
Mm-hmm.
They understood the deep roots of Western thought about living in common. They had rebelled against many distortions of the religious thinking that had come out of that. But they were really quite well educated.
So we need to require Latin for college admission, right?
That's all they needed. Yeah. One of the key figures of the Transcendentalist Circle is Frederick Henry Hedge, of whom Emerson called the Transcendentalist Circle Hedge's Club, because it would meet primarily when he would come down from his pastorate in Bangor, Maine. Oh, Hedge is just an amazing character. He's, at age 12, admitted to Harvard because he's already mastered Latin and Greek. His father is the professor of philosophy. But he's the one who goes to Germany and it really learns Kant, really learns the philosophical principle that I can't treat you as anything less than a moral agent.
So how are we going to get people back to studying Latin and Greek?
We're not.
I don't see that.
That ship has sailed. I tried with my own kids. Forrest Church and I used to say that we were the last two Unitarian ministers we knew who had education in both Latin and Greek. And so, but let's just say this. The historical, rhetorical, philosophical wisdom that's necessary to maintain democracy has to be maintained. And I think we are going to maintain a role, even if we're small, of being the reflective brains of religion in America. If we don't do what our Transcendentalist forebears did, which was to reach out and have influence even beyond their own denominational circle, we'll make a huge mistake. we become a shrinking little tribe, we'll make a huge mistake. But we can, at our best, be a thoughtful, catalytic forger of alliances. I think of, the role that we've played, Gordon, you know this, at Selma. That was one of the great moments of Unitarian Universalism in the 20th century. This brings me to my last point for this section. There is something deeply ironic in the fact that Unitarianism and Transcendentalism in the 19th century reached the high water mark of their influence in the Civil War. There is just no question in my mind but that's the case. Now, we should not go from that to sort of the conservative argument that abolitionism and Unitarians caused the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery caused the Civil War. And the fears behind the pro-slavery people that if they didn't continue to expand slavery, it would shrivel and die. It came to the point where only fighting fire with fire would work. In the 20th century, our influence reached its high water mark in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement of the 1960s. We are in another post-revolutionary period where reaction is in the saddle and we are on the defense. Another reason why we need to remember the periods when we really had the greatest influence and to figure out how to rebuild it. Chris, you were trying to break in.
Yeah, there's a couple things. John, I want to point out your role in having our denomination be the first denomination to go on record for legal same-sex marriage and the transformative role that's played in our culture at large. And as somebody who, who just witnessed the changes, how much Knoxville changed just because of that movement, going from pride celebrations that were a handful of people that you already knew to what feels like the liberation of Paris with thousands of people walking down so you really do have, there's been a remarkable transition of which Unitarianism and yourself and we put Bob West and Kim McLean and other of my predecessors in making advancements of that. And that's been a dramatic change. Maybe it doesn't feel as dramatic everywhere. In Knoxville, it's been amazing. And the day that the Supreme Court ruled was absolutely one of the most amazing days in so many ways. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that when Martin Luther King gave his speech on at the end of the Selma March on the steps, he evoked our Transcendentalist and Unitarian ancestors, and by asking that, he asked the question, how long must we wait? Not long, because truth crushed to the earth will rise again. That's William Cullen Bryant. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Theodore Parker. How long? Not long, because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Julia Ward Howe. And there may be another one in there that I'm forgetting, but it's that African-American preaching style where you ask a question and the ancestors' voices come forward, and it was our ancestors. That's a real spiritual merging of the African-American and Unitarian traditions in the history of our country. So.
Once to every soul and nation comes the moment to decide. Another one of the lines that he would cite. There's been a study by someone of King's rhetoric in which they found that of course, the bulk of his rhetoric comes from the Bible, the prophetic tradition. A second source of rhetoric in his speeches comes from what might be described broadly as American civil religion. But this analysis said that the third most common source was Unitarian poems and hymns.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Coretta Scott King told me in Selma that when she was a student in Boston, she really enjoyed the variety of religious institutions, so much larger than her hometown of Marion, Alabama.
Right.
She said, my two favorites were the Friends Meeting and Arlington Street Church.
Yeah. She says as much in her autobiography, too, so.
She, by the way, played an enormous role in the building of the Coalition for Freedom to Marry, where, I spent 10 years as the national co-chair. But when we got first John Lewis and then Coretta to climb on board, that was just a game changer with homophobia in the African American community.
Yeah.
And, I could tell you stories about working on that. One that pops to mind immediately, Chris, because you went to Divinity School in the great state of Indiana.
That is correct. Yeah.
Was that it was at the UU General Assembly in Indianapolis in, I think it must have been about 1997, that there was an action of immediate witness put forward that we should not only just commend our ministers for blessing same-sex unions, but actually advocate for civil marriage. And Denny Davidoff and I entered into a conspiracy, as we often did, of leadership. And I said, Denny, I'm going to rise to a point of personal privilege, and I'd like you to recognize me. This was completely unparliamentary. And then as the president of the association, I said, I would like everybody in this room who knows someone who is in a same-sex committed partnership or is in one themselves. And if, by the way, if both partners are here, please come forward. Stand with me on this platform for a minute. I want the General Assembly to see who they are voting about. And there were 100 people who came forward. Now that's the way we won the same-sex marriage initiative across the country, by pointing to real people. And by the way, it was Unitarian Universalists, not just me, but people like Fred Garcia, brilliant communications consultant, who said, quit talking about abstract rights. Talk about fairness. Show real people. So this goes back to how abolitionism finally prevailed in the United States in the most painful way possible with a civil war.
That's next week.
It focused on real people. It started with folks who philosophically would not let other folks be treated as abstractions or objects. That's how it's tied to transcendentalism. Again, I don't claim we started it. But when it smoldered, when it was not going well, it was that conviction that I think is with us still, that we owe one another the dignity of understanding that every human being is a moral and spiritual agent,
Human being.
and that we want to help one another bring out the best. But that's what social change is about. It's not about ideologies.
Yeah.
It's about helping people realize their full God-given, if you will, human potential.